Almost 2 years ago, I reviewed the BenQ EX2780Q, and I found it to be an absolutely excellent 1440p 144Hz gaming monitor. But now we have the EX2710Q, which offers 165Hz refresh rate and seemingly pretty much quite identical specifications. Now in the UK it can be found for roughly £350, while in the US it can be found for roughly $500. And in this review I'm going to be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag. Now to kick off this review I do have to talk about its refresh rate, and here it runs at 1440p at 165Hz. However, should you wish to run this refresh rate and resolution, you'll have to be connected over DisplayPort. Here the DisplayPort 1.4 input is supported, and here I had no problems whatsoever when it came to frame skipping when connected over to my RTX 2080 Super. However, if you have a HDMI input or / output, you'll be limited to 1440p at 144Hz because this monitor has two HDMI 2.0 ports, and due to the bandwidth limitations of this port standard, it means that you can't output any more than 144Hz at said resolution. If you want some more information about refresh rates and resolutions, do check out my dedicated video. It'll be down description below or indeed up on your pop-up banner. Now, will you notice the difference between 144Hz or 165Hz? I'm gonna bet to say that no, you're not gonna be able to notice the difference between the two refresh rates. But nevertheless, I thought to point that out. Now, what is important, however, is the overall response time of the monitor. And here, the monitor is absolutely phenomenal. Very much like its predecessor, the 2780Q, the 2710Q does a phenomenal job across the board, be it in terms of the overall response time that one can attain from the monitor to the minimal amount of inverse ghosting that you get even when you're dialing up the AMA, in other words the overdrive, to the maximum level 3 settings. Here through the OSD you have got 3 level increments, in other words level 3, 2, 1, and of course you can fully disable it at level 0. Now similarly, its input lag is seriously impressive, so much so that I would happily see myself using this monitor as a daily driver if I was playing some competitive Counter-Strike on a daily, and indeed I do, and as a result it's something that I can definitely recommend. Ultimately, what I'm trying to convey over here is this response time combined with its input lag and its refresh rate of 144Hz to 165Hz, depending on which source of input that you have, makes this monitor very easy to recommend for those people who are looking for a class-leading gaming IPS panel. Now, to further cement the point, BenQ have also incorporated blur reduction, which can be enabled or disabled through the OSD. Here you can run it simultaneously with AMA dial up to its maximum level and also run it with AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Better still, it doesn't affect the overall brightness of the monitor, which is something of a somewhat critique that I have of other monitors out there on the market. And ultimately, if you don't have any sort of eye strain issues, here I can definitely suggest running the blur reduction mode on and simultaneously running this monitor at 1440p at 165Hz with AMA dialed up to level 3. Now, I did quickly reference AMD FreeSync, and of course this monitor does have it built in, which is a great addition to the BenQ range, which normally does not have AMD FreeSync support. Here I can't test for AMD FreeSync, but I do have an RTX 2080 Super, and therefore when connected over DisplayPort to my graphics card, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without noticing any artifacts. Better still, while enabling HDR, I was able to play Destiny 2 at 1440p at 165Hz while also running NVIDIA G-Sync without any sort of issues either, which is always a good testament for those people who want to take this monitor and use it on a more casual basis. Now on that note, the monitor does have HDR technology. In fact, it's plastered at the front of the monitor with the HDR-I symbol. You can quickly flick through the different HDR modes, but frankly I would very much suggest you to run the display HDR mode, which comes as standard and therefore doesn't tinker around with the overall color accuracy. HDR is supported and therefore will get you over 400 nits. Now this is actually quite important because the monitor in its SDR won't reach over 400 nits and in fact is limited to around 250 nits, which is quite disappointing. We'll touch upon this further down in the brightness section, but the reason I'm pointing this out is that if you are going to be playing some HDR games, you're definitely going to want to enable HDR in order to attain the most brightest image that you can attain from this gaming monitor. Now with HDR out of the way, this perfectly leads me onto console gaming. Now if you have an Xbox or a PlayStation, you'll be able to run Full HD at 120Hz. If you have an Xbox, you'll be able to run 1440p at 120Hz. But thankfully, if you do want to run 4K, you can do so because this monitor does support a 4K input. At least tested via my 4K Blu-ray player, I had no such problems. And as such, both PlayStation and Xbox users can use a 4K signal input and therefore have a simulated 4K. If you want some more information about this in terms of how it affects console gaming, in other words the refresh rates and the resolutions and of course the inputs and outputs, then do check out my dedicated video. It'll be down in the description below or indeed up on your pop-up banner. Now while its gaming credentials are seriously impressive, what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here I was actually left pretty outstandard at the overall sRGB color accuracy, specifically when set to the sRGB mode through the OSD. Now the monitor does run a 27-inch IPS panel, and when I tested it via my Datacolor SpiderX Elite, I tested a 99.1% sRGB gamut coverage and a 102.9% sRGB gamut volume. You can see here how it compares to the sRGB standard. When it comes to color accuracy, you've got an average delta of 1.07 and a maximum of 1.67, which is seriously impressive for a gaming monitor of its class. Now the sRGB mode through the OSD will certainly be of interest to image editors or video graders, but should you want colors to pop a little bit more or indeed have a wide color gamut, you'll want to go on one of the preset modes, or better still, to adjust the RGB values yourself through the OSD menu. Now I share my own settings further down in this review, so do stay tuned for that. As you'll be able to see on your screen right now, the overall Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 levels have seriously increased in comparison to the sRGB mode that we previously had. And furthermore, you can see how it compares to the sRGB standard, and also overall color accuracy has dropped to an average delta of 3.37 and a maximum of 7.97. Further emphasizing my point that if you do want to work in the sRGB space, you'll want to run the sRGB OSD setting, or if you want something that pops a little bit more and gives you a wide color gamut, then you should be looking at the other modes instead. Now moving on, we get onto contrast ratio, and here the monitor has got an IPS panel, and it's no surprise to see that it has a lower contrast ratio in comparison to the equivalent VA panel. And as such, here I had it tested via my Calibrite CC Display Plus calibrator at 908:1. Now when it comes to brightness, I was actually left pretty disappointed. Now there's no problems when it comes to HDR, where it's reaching 413 nits, and as such hitting the display HDR 400 standard. However, when it comes to SDR brightness, it is limited to 235 nits with a minimum brightness of 62 nits, which might not be as dim as some people might like, and equally not as bright. To put it into perspective, my personal monitor runs at around 55% brightness, and here the monitor that I was using, the BenQ EX2710Q, was running permanently at 100% brightness. In fact, when I had a lot of sun coming into my room, I noted that the monitor was a bit too dim for me to use in terms of SDR. Of course, yet again, I had no problems when running HDR, but I suspect a lot of people using this monitor will be using it in both SDR and HDR ways, and it's a real shame that BenQ has limited the peak SDR brightness to around 230 nits, and as such might throw off certain consumers. Now moving swiftly on, we get onto brightness uniformity, and in terms of my panel, it didn't do too well in terms of its top right corner. In fact, the top half of the monitor wasn't all that good. As for backlight bleed, I did notice a little bit of bleed at the bottom right corner and the top left corner. Of course, this is somewhat panel lottery, so you might have a better or indeed worse panel than myself. Now moving on to the monitor's OSD, it can be accessed through a little joystick button found behind the monitor. Now when you were to press on this little button, you'll find a quick access to certain settings, and these can be actually customized through the settings itself. Now here the OSD allows a variety of different modes to be used in different inputs, which is quite nice, although it can be a little bit confusing when you are launching up the monitor for the first time. You've got standard, game and cinema modes, and then you've got scenario, which you can enable or disable, which I do find is somewhat of a redundant feature, at least in my opinion. Now as the quick menu, as you can see over here, you've got standard, game and cinema modes that you can customize, and in this case, as I use standard, I've got AMA brightness and volume set to my own desire. Now as for the color modes, you've got the different modes to choose from. I would very much urge you not to use any of the HDRI settings, but to use the sRGB or indeed the custom mode. Now as for the custom mode, this will give you a little bit more vibrant image, as I mentioned before in the image quality section, and here I've got color vibrance at 10 and light tuner at 0, which is the default values. Brightness and contrast and sharpness will be dependent on your own personal subjective opinion. As for BI+, this is a sensor found towards the front of the monitor. You can enable it or disable it in order for it to customize the overall temperature of the monitor on the fly. Now as for the color temperature itself, I've gone on user define, and you can see over here I've got my settings at the R value at 99, G at 94 and blue at 100. Of course this very much depends on your own setting as to how you like to set it, so you can play around to this to your heart's content, and this is just the settings that I thought to share myself. Now as for AMA, it's the overdrive level, and you've got 3 level increments, and again I referenced this before in the gaming section of this review, and I leave it on its maximum mode. As for blur reduction, I don't personally leave this enabled, but if you were to enable it, you can do this simultaneously while running AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, which is a nice little touch that some of its competitors cannot do. As for eye care, as you can see, the BI Plus is grayed out due to it being disabled, but you've got the color weakness, the blue light mode, and also you can adjust by the duration if you so wish. Now as for audio, the monitor does have built-in speakers, 2 2-watt speakers and a 5-watt subwoofer, which combined have a 2.1 channel output. Here you've got a few different EQ settings for you to choose from, and the cinema one is the one that I would definitely suggest. Now subjectively, I will say the actual audio quality of the speakers is pretty impressive, at least for built-in monitor speakers. Of course, if you're an audiophile or you want bettered audio quality, do get yourself a set of bookshelf speakers and or a DAC and a set of headphones. Now as for the system menu, you've got the OSD settings, you've got the LED indicator which is positioned underneath the monitor. This can be disabled if you so wish, and finally you've got some information at the resolution and the refresh rate that your monitor is currently running on. Now with the OSD section out of the way, I should also touch upon the build quality and the overall stand. Now here the monitor has a 3-side borderless design, which is definitely good, although its bottom bezel is a little bit thick, and that's because of the housing of the audio drivers. Now nevertheless, the monitor has got a built-in stand which provides you height, tilt and pivot adjustment, although it can't be rotated. Furthermore, the adjustments that you have are somewhat limited, at least in my experience, and as a result isn't as well ergonomically designed in comparison to competitor products that you can find out there on the market. Now as for the look of it, it's got a silverish look in terms of its stand, and it's got a orange accent, which again might throw off certain consumers because it might not fit well with your overall setup. Nevertheless, you can replace the stand if you so wish, if you have a VESA compatible stand, and therefore of course you can mount it on a monitor arm. And so this brings me on to my verdict, and quite frankly the BenQ EX2710Q is a stonkingly good monitor, and while it has got limited SDR brightness, this is arguably one of its only flaws. Of course the limiting stand might be another one that you might want to consider, but given the overall price tag at around £350 or $500 in the US, and the overall image quality and gaming performance that you're attaining from this monitor, I can see myself actively recommending it, and as a result it gets my Best Buy award. Now the only thing to consider, however, is that the BenQ EX2780Q that I referenced at the beginning of this review is also a ridiculously good monitor. And in fact, at the time of filming and in the UK, it can be found for a stupidly low price of £250, which makes it £100 cheaper than the newer EX2710Q. Now why you might want to consider the new model over its predecessor is purely because of sRGB color accuracy, and if this isn't of interest to you, then of course buy its alternative instead immediately before it raises in price. Links will be down in the description below in case you're interested, including links to my social media platforms. And yes, that's a little shameless plug. Now if you've liked this video, I'd definitely appreciate dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated and continues allowing me to do independent, honest, detailed reviews. And as such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.